On December 23, 2015, Richard Dabate called 911. He told police a terrifying story. An intruder had entered his home. His wife, Connie Dabate, had been shot, and he had been attacked, tied up, and injured. At first glance, it sounded like a violent home invasion. But investigators had a problem. The timeline did not stay still. There were alarm records, phone records, computer activity, physical evidence, and one small device Connie had been wearing that morning. A Fitbit. It could not identify a killer. It could not explain motive. It could not tell investigators what happened inside the home. But it could record movement. And in this case, those movements told a different story. Welcome to F for Forensics Case Files. This is episode 2. The Fitbit that contradicted an alibi. The story, he told. The case began in Ellington, Connecticut, 2 days before Christmas. Richard and Connie Dabate lived in a family home with their 2 young sons. On the morning of December the 23rd, the children were at school. Richard told investigators that he had left for work, realized he forgot his laptop, and returned home. According to his account, when he got back, he encountered an unknown man inside the house. He described the intruder as masked and dressed in camouflage. He said the man attacked him, demanded money and bank information, and eventually shot Connie when she returned home. Richard claimed he was then tied to a chair, cut with a box cutter, and burned with a torch before the intruder fled. It was a dramatic story, but in forensic work, a dramatic story is not enough. Every statement has to be tested against the evidence, and the evidence in this case started to form its own timeline. The digital scene. Most people think of a crime scene as a physical place. A room, a weapon, a door, a window, a body. But modern investigations often have a second crime scene, a digital one. The digital scene includes every device, account, log, timestamp, and system that recorded activity before, during, or after the incident. In this case, investigators looked beyond the physical scene. They looked at the home alarm system. They looked at computer activity. They looked at phone records. They looked at account logins. They looked at the timeline of movement inside the home. And then they looked at Connie's Fitbit. The Fitbit was important because it was not trying to solve a crime. It was not built for law enforcement. It was a consumer device designed to track activity. Steps, movement, distance, patterns of activity. But that is exactly what made it useful. A device that quietly records ordinary behavior can become powerful when a person's story depends on timing. The timeline begins to break. The state's timeline placed Connie's movements that morning in a very specific sequence. Connie left for the gym around 8:46 a.m. When she discovered her gym class had been canceled, she returned home. Her Fitbit showed activity consistent with that movement. The home alarm system also recorded activity when the garage door opened. That detail mattered, because Richard's story depended on Connie coming home, encountering an intruder, and running almost immediately into the basement. But the Fitbit suggested something else. It showed that Connie continued moving inside the home after the time Richard claimed she had already been attacked. That is the forensic turning point. The Fitbit did not say who committed the crime, but it challenged the timeline. And in a case built around an alibi, a broken timeline can be devastating. In forensic analysis, timelines are not just helpful. They are often the structure that holds the entire case together. A statement may sound believable when heard by itself, but when that statement is placed next to device logs, alarm records, phone activity, computer use, and movement data, inconsistencies can become visible. That is what happened here. The investigation was no longer just about whether Richard's story sounded possible. It was about whether the story survived contact with the data, what the Fitbit could and could not prove. This is where it is important to be careful. A Fitbit is not a camera. It does not show a video of what happened. It does not know who is wearing it unless the device is properly associated with the person. It does not understand fear, intent, motive, or violence. It cannot say, this person was murdered at this exact second. And it cannot replace a full investigation. But wearable data can answer narrower questions. Was the person moving? Was there activity after a claimed time? Does the movement pattern fit the statement? Does the device timeline match other evidence? Does the data support or contradict the story? In this case, the Fitbit became one piece of a larger evidentiary puzzle. The question was not, did the Fitbit solve the murder? The better question was, did the Fitbit data help show that the suspect's timeline was wrong? And the answer, according to prosecutors, was yes. That is the difference between a sensational headline and forensic reality. The headline says, "The Fitbit solved the case." The forensic version says, "The Fitbit helped contradict a timeline, and that contradiction became powerful when combined with other evidence." The other digital evidence. Investigators also examined Richard's digital activity that morning. According to the evidence summarized in the court record, Richard had claimed he left for work and returned home after realizing he forgot his laptop. But digital evidence suggested his activity was tied to the home. Computer and account records became part of the timeline. The home alarm system also recorded arming and disarming events, and the panic alarm was activated shortly after Connie's Fitbit stopped registering steps. That sequence mattered, because when multiple systems record independent activity, investigators can compare them. One log may have limitations, one device may have error, one timestamp may need validation. But when different sources point toward the same inconsistency, the timeline becomes stronger. That is why modern forensic work is often less about one smoking gun and more about correlation. A Fitbit records movement. An alarm system records door activity. A computer records web activity. A phone records messages or calls. A network records logins. A cloud account records access. Each system sees only part of the story. The forensic examiner's job is to place those parts in order. The courtroom question, but before digital evidence can persuade a jury, it has to survive legal scrutiny. That became a major issue in this case. The defense challenged the Fitbit evidence. And that challenge raised an important forensic question. How reliable is consumer wearable data? A Fitbit is not a law enforcement device. It is not a medical-grade forensic instrument. It uses sensors and algorithms to translate motion into steps and activity. And some of those algorithms are proprietary, meaning the company does not publicly reveal every internal detail of how the calculations work. So how can the court trust the data? That question led to a reliability hearing. The court heard expert testimony about how the device worked, how it measured movement, whether the technology had been tested, whether the research had been peer-reviewed, and whether the device was generally accepted for measuring steps. The court ultimately allowed the Fitbit data to be admitted. Years later, in 2025, the Connecticut Supreme Court upheld that decision. That is a major lesson for digital forensics. Digital evidence does not become powerful just because it exists. It becomes powerful when it can be authenticated, explained, tested, and placed into context. If an examiner cannot explain where the data came from, how it was collected, what it means, and what its limitations are, then the data can lose its power. But when the data is properly supported, it can become difficult to ignore. The human story behind the data. Behind the technology was a human tragedy. Connie Dabate was a wife, a mother, and a person whose life was taken. Her case became widely known because of the Fitbit evidence, but the device should not overshadow the victim. The technology did not create the tragedy. It helped investigators understand the timeline around it. And that distinction matters. Forensics is not about gadgets. It is about truth. It is about reconstructing events when someone is no longer able to speak. It is about testing claims against evidence. It is about asking whether the story people tell matches the traces they leave behind. In this case, the wearable device did something simple. It recorded movement. But simple data can become powerful when a person's freedom, a victim's story, and the truth all depend on time. The verdict and appeal. Richard Dabate was convicted of murder, tampering with or fabricating physical evidence, and making a false statement. He was sentenced to 65 years in prison. He maintained his innocence and appealed his conviction. On appeal, he challenged several issues, including the admission of the Fitbit evidence. The Connecticut Supreme Court found that some prosecutorial conduct at trial was improper, but it also concluded that those issues did not deprive him of a fair trial. The court affirmed the conviction, and it upheld the use of the Fitbit evidence. That decision matters beyond this one case, because wearables are everywhere now. Forensic lessons. So what can forensic professionals learn from the Connie Dabate case? Lesson 1. A timeline can expose a false story. When a suspect gives a statement, investigators should not examine it in isolation. The statement should be compared against every available source of time-based evidence. Lesson 2. Wearable devices can become silent witnesses. They do not tell the whole story, but they can record activity that supports or contradicts a claim. Lesson 3. Consumer data needs context. Step counts, movement, heart rate, and activity logs must be interpreted carefully. They are not magic, they are data points. Lesson 4. Correlation is key. The strongest timelines are built from multiple sources: device logs, alarm records, phone activity, computer activity, physical evidence, and witness statements. Lesson 5. Admissibility matters. Digital evidence must be collected, authenticated, validated, and explained in a way the court can understand. And Lesson 6. The smallest device in the room may preserve the biggest contradiction. The Fitbit in this case did not speak. It did not accuse anyone. It did not explain motive. It simply recorded movement. But in forensic work, movement matters. Time matters. Patterns matter. And when a person's story depends on a timeline, even a small device can become a major piece of evidence. The Connie Dabate case reminds us that digital forensics is no longer limited to computers and phones. The evidence may be on a wrist, in a pocket, in the cloud, on a home alarm panel, or hidden in the quiet records of an ordinary device. Because in the digital age, the truth may not always come from what someone says. Sometimes it comes from what the data remembers. This has been F for Forensics Case Files. In our next case file, we look at one of the most infamous examples of metadata in criminal investigation. A decades-old case where a suspect thought he could safely send police a floppy disk. But inside that disk was a clue he did not realize he had left behind. Next on F for Forensics Case Files, the metadata that gave him away.